What? Okay, great. Praise God. Oh, welcome back. All right, we were talking about Jacob, and I had said that he was the greatest con man in history, or at least in my opinion, in that he stole the blessing of God from his brother. He did it in two parts. One, he took the physical inheritance by taking the birthright, the right to the land, the right to all the possessions of the family, etc. And then he did a second scheme in which that he paraded as his brother and talked his father and convinced his father to pass the spiritual blessing on to him. And that's a significant thing for us to remember, that actually the covenant of Abraham actually has a two-part dimension to it. There is a dimension of spiritual blessing, and there's a dimension of physical blessing as well. One of the things that is an issue in the Christian church, and I mentioned in our last class that there was a couple that had told me that when they had this class before, that it really made them re-understand and renegotiate their thinking about how that God is working with the Jewish people. And the reason that some of that difficulty has arisen is because that some people don't understand that there's a spiritual and a physical inheritance of part of the Abrahamic covenant. The church today, we live in the spiritual inheritance of Abraham, but that doesn't mean that the Christian church is supposed to go over and claim Jerusalem. The Jewish people, the physical inheritance of Abraham is passed on to the Jewish people. And maybe we'll see that a little bit clearer as we go on. But at any rate, Abraham's covenant was passed on to Isaac and then to his son Jacob. And Jacob took it by deception, and he took it by thievery. He got it illegitimately. However, that doesn't mean that it isn't, wasn't intended for him. I'm not really sure how to discern all of that. I'm certain that God could have gotten it to him in a more legitimate way. But regardless of how he took it and he received it, it was still God's intent for him to have that covenant promise. And he, it was reconfirmed because after he had deceived his father had given him the blessing, and then his father realized, wait a minute, I've done something I didn't intend to do. Then he called him back in, and he specifically blessed him, specifically gave him the blessing, determinately passing it on to him. And that is in Genesis 27. Sorry, I didn't get the book open again before I came back to the classroom. But specifically in Genesis 27 and then in 28, he calls him in and he gives him a reconfirmation. This is the blessing I want you to have. Therefore, God give thee the dew of the heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine, and let people serve thee and nations bow down to thee, and the Lord and be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. You see, that's specifically a quote from the Abrahamic covenant. Everyone that blesses you is cursed. Everyone that blesses you is blessed. Everyone that curses you is cursed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. Again, an exact quote from the Abrahamic blessing. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in thee shall thy seed, and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Again, the main prerogative or the main dimension of the Abrahamic covenant, that all the earth is going to be blessed, all the families of the earth be blessed through them. And so when God gave him that covenant, even though he got it through deception, even though he got it through trickery, it was still confirmed through the one who legitimately could pass it on to him, that he intended for that blessing to be passed on. Isaac gave him the first portion of the blessing, not intending to give it to him. But then he deliberately came back and said, now I'm speaking the specific points of the Abrahamic covenant. I'm speaking those to you because now I'm aware of who you are. You're not deceiving me, but I still want you to know this is God's covenant blessing to give you. Now, not only that, but then Jacob, realizing what he had done, that he had deceived his brother, that he had stolen from his brother, and knowing that his brother, was ready to take revenge, is advised that he needs to flee the country. So he goes to Pandanaram to his uncle Laban, who becomes his father-in-law as well. But at any rate, so he's on his way to try to escape, and he gets to a place called Luz, which we now know of as Bethel, the house of God. He gets to Bethel, and he is, exhausted. He's ready to fall asleep. He's ready to collapse. He's ready to spend the night. And so he takes a rock and makes it into a pillow. Now, I have to tell you that my feeling is that Jacob was probably from the deep south in the U.S. Because in the deep south in the U.S., we have one word that refers to two different things. We don't have pillows, we have pillars. And so he slept the night on a rock, and it was his pillow. The next day, he took that rock and he stood it up on its end, and he made a pillar out of it and said, this is my altar to represent the fact that God appeared to me. And so when he had a pillow that was a pillar, in the South, it's a pillar that was a pillar. And so, he had both of those all in one item. But he took this rock and he slept on the rock. He must have really been exhausted to use a rock for a pillow. But I've been to some hotels that offered me that, I think. But at any rate, during the night, God appeared. And God initiated this conversation. Jacob did not ask for God to talk to him. Jacob was not seeking for a revelation from God. God just totally out of his own sovereignty and out of his own independent will appeared and spoke to Jacob. And when he did, he told him that he was going to cause him to be blessed, and that he was going to send him off into that land that he was going to, and he was going to bring him back. In the 28th chapter, beginning in verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above it, above the ladder that he saw in heaven, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land wherein thou liest, to thee will I give it. Now he said, the land that you are sleeping in is the land I'm going to give you. Even though he's going to go to Pandanaram, he's not speaking of Pandanaram, he's speaking of the covenant land that was the land that God had given to Abraham and Isaac, and now he's giving it to Jacob. The land wherein thou liest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and they shall spread around to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in thee and thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. This is a repeat of the Abrahamic covenant, right? Everything that God said to Abraham, everything that God said to Isaac, everything that Isaac said to Jacob, now God personally is appearing and saying it to Jacob. That you're going to be blessed, and that your seed going to be blessed. You're going to have the land of the east, the north, the south, the west, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and I will keep thee in the places wherein thou goest, and will bring thee again to this land. Even though that you go out into a different place, and I'm going to keep you while you're there, and then I'm going to bring you back to this land. Remember, God's covenant people have to live in God's covenant land. Abraham lived in the covenant land. Isaac lived in the covenant land. Even when that the servant said, what if I can't find a bride that's willing to come here? He says, hey, the deal is off. The one thing that is important is that you make sure that Isaac stays here. Then there's a famine, and it looks like that the only way that Isaac can support himself is to go outside, go to Egypt or wherever, and then God says, no, you stay here. He stayed there. He planted even in the middle of a famine and produced 100-fold return. He says to Jacob, Jacob, you are fleeing away from the land. You stole from your brother. Your life is in danger. Yes, you got to get out. You go to Laban, wherever you're going to go, but I'm going to bring you back because your destiny is tied and anchored to the land of Israel. And he says, and behold, I am with thee, I'll keep thee in all the places wherever thou goest, and I will bring thee again to this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done all that which I have spoken to thee of. I'll not stop until I've done everything that I've promised you. That was the covenant that God gave to Jacob at that point. Now, when Jacob woke up the next morning, then he said, man, I was at the very gates of heaven, and I didn't realize where I was. And so he took the pillow, turned it up, made a pillar out of it, and then that became an altar. He made a covenant relationship with God. Now, when he woke up from that vision, he repeated all the things that were significant to him. And he says, God, if you're going to do this, and if you're going to do that, and if you're going to do the other thing. Now, the thing that is misleading in the English version of the Bible is the word if. The word if can also be translated since. And I don't believe that Jacob was bargaining with God. Most people make it sound when they read this story as if they think Jacob is striking a bargain with God. You know, God, if you'll do this, and if you'll do this, and if you'll do this, then I'm going to give you a tithe. Wow, what a magnanimous offer on Jacob's part. God, if you'll give me $1, I'll give you 10 cents. I mean, just think of it. I mean, if we think that we are earning anything from God, or that we are bargaining, that we're having some bargaining chip to use for God by promising to give him a tithe or whatever we want to give him, how ludicrous can that be? If you'll give me 100, I'll give you 10. There's no advantage on God's part to get into a bargain like that, right? Okay, but the other translation that I would suggest to you that is probably the most accurate, or the more accurate, is since you are going to protect me, since you're going to bless me, since you're going to prosper me, since you are going to bring me back safely to my father's house and to this land, then I want to give to you 10%. Okay? I want to give you the tithe. It wasn't that Jacob was trying to bargain with God. He was just trying to say, I want to acknowledge what you're doing. I want to acknowledge that you have already promised me all these blessings, and to make a constant and a consistent awareness in my life of your blessing, I am going to take 10% of everything that you prosper me with and give it back to you. And that isn't in order to get something from you. That's just to show that I recognize that you are the source that's already giving to me. So the institution of the tithe that Jacob gives at that point really doesn't seem to me to be a bargain, but it seems to be a recognition or an appreciation. Okay, in point number 6 on page 6, it says, destiny must be played out on the stage of the covenant land. We've already mentioned to you that God says, I'm going to bring you back. And that's because that Jacob's destiny had to be anchored to that covenant land. And then he goes and he lives with his uncle Laban, who becomes his father-in-law. And at the end of that time, then after he's served all the time there, something like 20 years, then he's ready to take the fulfillment that God has given him, the fulfillment of the promise God has given him, and come back to the covenant land, come back to the promised land. And as he's coming back, he has a struggle. And that struggle is with, at one place the Bible says an angel, one place it says a man. We have no idea exactly who. But he struggles with this entity for the all night long. And then just before the sun rises the next morning, then he says, now, I want you to bless me. The amazing thing here is that he's already been blessed by Isaac before, when Isaac was deceived, thinking he was Esau. Then after he realizes that it was a deception, then he blesses him again determinately, and then he gets out to Luz, to Bethel, and God appears and gives him a blessing. And so why in the world does he think that he has to struggle to get another blessing? And the point to that story, in my perspective, is that it was that point when the angel says to him, well, who are you? And he says, I'm Jacob. And he says, no, we're not going to call you Jacob anymore. We're going to call you Israel. The problem that he was struggling with was his own personal identity. He kept seeing himself as Jacob. Jacob is the word that means supplanter. And so he was a deceiver. He was a conniver. He was a cheat. He was a con man. And he got those blessings, number one, the physical blessing, number two, the spiritual blessing, from Esau by his deception. And even at that point, he's still depending upon his own scheming to protect him, because he sends all kinds of bribes in front of him so that when his brother Esau sees all this cattle and all these herds and everything coming, that his brother could be deceived or bribed into accepting Jacob and not killing him or whatever. Okay, so he's still working on his own way of being a conniver, his own way of being a schemer, his own way of trying to get things on his behalf. And then God says to him, let's quit using that term Jacob. Let's start using a new name. I want you to have a new identity, to recognize that you're a prince from God, that you're a prince with God, that you already are in that position of grace. And so, at any rate, at that point, his name is changed to Israel. Israel becomes now the symbol of the covenant. It's a man, it's a nation, it's a land. So from that point on, we now have Israel as the key to human destiny. The man individual, Jacob, becomes Israel. The people become Israel, and the country becomes Israel. All three are significant. When he gets back to meet Esau, Esau willingly says, I'm going to move. I'm going to leave, and I'm going to leave this land with you. Why? Because it's always one son in the land, one heir to the covenant promise at a time. It's multi-generational, but it's one heir at a time. So, Jacob, Israel, gets back to the promised land, and he starts raising a family. And we remember he has 12 sons. There are 11 at the time that this story happens. Benjamin comes on a little bit later. But we have all the sons, and Joseph seems to be the favored one of the father. And he's the one that gets the multicolored coat, as Hollywood says, the technicolored coat. He's the one who has all the favor and all the blessing. All the other brothers are out working in the field, Joseph apparently is still kind of hanging around the house being pampered, and he goes out to visit his brothers, and his brothers say, here is this dreamer who's been having these dreams in which that he's seeing us bowing down before him, and this is our chance. We are going to take revenge. At first, they decide to kill him, but then one of them comes up with an idea. Hey, wait a minute, why do we want to kill him? Because he's merchandise. We could sell him as a slave, and then we're rid of him, and we also have money in our pocket. And so this is a way to have our cake and eat it too. And so they said, we're going to sell him as a slave. So they sell him as a slave and send him off to Egypt. They think, we are done with him. Well, you know the story of what happens to Joseph while he's in Egypt. He is a slave, he's in Potiphar's house, and he rises up to a position of leadership. And in that position of leadership, he has rule over Potiphar's property, and he has nobody that he has to answer to except Potiphar himself. He has the keys to the house. He can go in and out of the house at will, that sort of thing. And so Potiphar's wife gets a crush on him, and she wants to have a relationship with him. And Joseph says, no, I can't do that. It would be a sin against my God. And so he is resistant to it. And then eventually she tries to entrap him, and he refuses. He runs off, and then she grabs his coat in the process and uses that as evidence and gets him indicted and thrown into jail. So he's in the jail, and he stays there for a while, and then he kind of rises to prominence, leadership within the prison. And a couple of guys have dreams, and he interprets the dreams, and then the butler says, well, I'm going to get you out of jail, but he doesn't. He forgets to get out a free jail card, and so he doesn't get him out, and he stays, for another couple of years. Then eventually there's a dream that the Pharaoh has, and Joseph is given the privilege to interpret the dream, and all of a sudden he is the second man in the kingdom. At that point, he has the privilege to eliminate anybody he wanted to. He could have eliminated Potiphar's wife because she had all these plots against him. He could have eliminated Potiphar because he threw him in jail without giving him a fair trial. He could have executed anybody, and there would have been no questions asked because he was at that position closest to the monarch. But we see something in his character, that he has a forgiving character. Well, eventually his brothers show up. They're a famine, they're starving, and they come to beg for grain from Egypt. I've never really understood the story how that they had to make an appearance before Joseph himself, because Joseph was the top guy in the country other than Pharaoh, and I would assume that he had a number of people in rank under him that they would have had to talk to, but for some reason they wound up having to appear before Joseph himself asking for permission to buy grain. They are on their knees begging exactly the prophecy that he saw in that dream, bowing down, paying homage to him. And Joseph could have said at that minute, hey, my vision is fulfilled. Off with their heads now. Because that was the vision that he had. But he didn't ask for their heads. What he does is he says, I think you guys are spies. And because that you're spies, I can imprison you and I can execute you and whatever. And they start groveling and begging for mercy. Notice that he asks two questions when he starts interrogating them as spies. They say, we're all brothers. Now, he looks at them and he says, so, you're all brothers. Do you have a father? Is he still alive? And they said, yes. He had a reason for asking that question. The reason he asked that question is because that Abraham passed the covenant to Isaac. Isaac passed the covenant to Jacob, who's now Israel. Jacob has to pass the covenant to one son. Joseph thinks he's the one who's going to get that covenant. But he didn't give it to him before he got sold as a slave into Egypt. If my daddy is still alive, there's a possibility that I could still get that covenant. I want to know, is your father still alive? In his heart, he's saying, is my daddy still alive? And they say, yes. And then he says, and do you have any other brothers? Well, yeah, we have this one other little brother. And, he's kind of the favorite of my daddy's, in the daddy's house. And he says, well, I am not going to give you any grain until you bring that little boy over here. Now, just think about this. A guy who's accusing you of being a spy, and he wants you to bring your little brother to prove that you're not a spy. I mean, there's no logic to that question at all, right? Why did Joseph insist that they bring the little brother Benjamin? Because Egypt is outside the covenant land, right? And we know that you don't send the covenant heir outside the land. Remember, Isaac couldn't go out and marry a girl. The girl had to come to him. And so he says, since Benjamin is my father's favorite, maybe my daddy might have passed the covenant blessing on to him. And if he has passed the covenant blessing on to him, then he's not going to send him out of the land. So here's my way of getting some inside information by asking questions that aren't quite too leading. And so he's saying, if you got another brother, then you got to bring him. At that point, they would have said, oh no, and they said, oh no. And they says, my father, is really attached to that guy, and if something happens to him, then we're in bad trouble. And remember, they said all that, but they didn't say, but he can't leave because there's this covenant relationship that ties him to the land. That's exactly what Joseph was trying to hear. So finally, they get, and then the other thing is that if he can get Benjamin out of the land and get him down there, and he throws him in jail, if we can get him down here and keep him separated from the daddy, then daddy's never going to pass that covenant on to him because it can still come to me. Okay? And so he gets everybody down in Egypt. He gives them grain. They go back and remember the whole story. Okay, now, then he finally gets to the point to where he reveals himself. And he says, guys, I'm your brother Joseph. And everybody, it can't be. And he says, here, take these wagons, go home, bring my daddy back to Egypt. I'm going to take care of you for the rest of the famine. Israel is resistant. Even though he loves his son Joseph, even though the loss of his son Joseph was the most tragic thing that's happened in his life, and he has an opportunity to get reunited with him, he's still resistant to come. He gets to the border between the covenant land, between the promised land Israel and Egypt, and God has to personally appear to him and convince him to take one more step and cross the border, because he knows how important it is for him to live in the covenant land. He had lived outside the covenant land, when he ran away from Esau. And then when he came back, he says, man, I ain't never leaving again. And now he's faced with, he's got to leave. And he has to have God personally appear to him and tell him it's okay. Why is it okay? Because he has to go down there because he still has a covenant that he has to pass on to the next generation. So he goes to Egypt, and we don't know exactly how long it was that he's living in Egypt, but during that time, he wants to, Joseph, I think, is just walking around waiting for his father to eventually say, I'm going to pass the covenant on to you. And then there's the day when Joseph says, or Jacob says, I'm going to bless my grandchildren, your sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Joseph brings Ephraim and Manasseh before Israel. And then Israel, blesses them. He doesn't bless the father. He blesses the grandchildren. Remember the story how he crossed his hands so that he put his left hand on the older son and his right hand on the younger son. The right hand is the hand of blessing, and the left hand is not so strong of a blessing. In fact, in some cultures, the left hand is actually a hand of cursing rather than a hand of blessing. And but he isn't cursing Manasseh. He's just not blessing him as strongly as he does Ephraim. But he crosses his hands. Joseph says, switch your hands. And he says, no, this is the way it is. You see, it's always been that way. It wasn't Ishmael, it was Isaac. It wasn't Esau, it was Jacob. And now it's not Manasseh, it's Ephraim. It's not always the youngest son. In fact, it never is the oldest son. It's always the younger one that gets the blessing. But what happens here? He now has passed the covenant blessing on to two sons of Joseph. Joseph didn't get the blessing, but he got a double portion of a blessing that's going to be distributed through all of the sons. There were 12 sons, and now we have 13 divisions, right? Because we have the 11 other brothers. Joseph doesn't get a blessing, but his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, each get a blessing. So that means there are 13 people to divide up 12 portions among. So he gets a double blessing by having the two sons blessed. This is the beginning of something that we're going to see unravel in the next step. Because now the blessing isn't only going to one individual, but it's actually going to multiple individuals. Here's what happens. The Israelites wind up spending 400 years in slavery in Egypt. Every generation, a father calls his son before him, and he says, I'm going to pass on to you the covenant that God has given us since our father Abraham. And he'd lay his hand on his son, and he'd say, everyone that blesses you is going to be blessed. Everyone that curses you is going to be cursed. And I'm going to multiply your seed, and through your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And this is your land on the east and the west and the north and the south. And, they would say that ritualistically in every generation to every son. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't prove it. But you weren't there, so you can't disprove it. And so since I'm the one with the microphone, we'll go with my opinion, okay? I can only imagine that somewhere along the line, one of those boys reached up and grabbed his daddy's hand and said, what kind of a fool are you? Trying to tell me that everyone that curses me is going to be cursed. I've been out there working like a dog as a slave all day long, and the slave driver with his whip has been taking stripes right across my back every day, and he's been cursing me, and God ain't cursed him yet. And ain't nobody ever blessed me, and so therefore, how can anybody ever be blessed? And you say, we have all the land that goes to the east and the west and the north and the south, and look at here, we're slaves. We don't even own the house that we live in. How can you say all those stupid things and expect me to believe it? Now, I wasn't there, so I can't prove it happened, but I can't imagine that anything other than that must have happened. Somewhere during that 400 years of slavery, the people totally forgot that they had a blessing from God and that they were a unique people. They didn't seem like a unique people. They didn't feel like a unique people. They weren't being treated like a unique people. There was nothing that would relate to the reality that they were experiencing that could relate that to the covenant promise that was being spoken. And I think they rejected it. In fact, when you read the book of Exodus, it said, and God remembered his promise to his people. It didn't say they remembered the promise to the people. It said God remembered it. I personally believe the people had totally forgotten what God was telling them. And so God raises up Moses and sends Moses down to Egypt to tell the people that he's going to release them and he's going to let them go free. But before we get to Moses, I want to tell you one last thing about Joseph. In the New Testament, when you read in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, the great roll call of faith, we have a list of all the great things that the people did. Remember, it tells about, when by faith, Abraham, went out to a land that he didn't know, and it just goes on and tells us, one person after another, and says, by faith he did these great exploits. When it gets to Joseph, it says, and by faith Joseph fed the nations when there was a famine in the land. No? Okay, good. I see that green collar. That means that I know that you're a second-year student, so you're learning, okay? All right. No, it doesn't say by faith he fed the nations. It says by faith he said, take my bones back and bury them in Israel. And you say, my Lord, couldn't we think of something more dramatic to say about that? About just picking out your burial place? But that was a faith statement. Because every covenant heir has to play out his destiny in the covenant land. And Joseph said, I know that I am the second in command in Egypt. And I know they're going to build me a mausoleum here. And I know that I'm going to be commemorated and memorialized in Egypt. But that's not my final destiny. My final destiny is my association with the covenant land. So when you people go back 400 years from now, you make sure you pick up my bones and take them back there, because that's my final and ultimate covenant destiny, to be in the land. Okay, so Joseph knew the importance of being back in the land of Egypt, of Israel, even though that it might be 400 years and it might just be decayed bones that would get there. So Moses shows up and he starts telling the people that God has a covenant promise for them and God has a relationship for them, and that he's going to bless them and take them out of the country. And the interesting thing is that from this point on, when it talks about the covenant relationship that God has, God speaks of the children of Israel. Before it was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now it's children of Israel. Because God at this point is now making his covenant relationship with all the people of Israel, not just with one individual at a time. And so God renews his promise, but it's across the board to all the descendants. And he's blessed the two sons of Joseph. He's given them a double blessing. And so therefore, there's a special blessing, even though it's not the unique blessing, for Joseph. The one thing that's interesting is that prior to this time, the only requirement for being the heir to the covenant was that you were the right son who was picked at the right time. Jacob is a great example. He was a cheat, he was a liar, he was a schemer, but he was still the one that God picked. You and I would never have picked him. We would have said, look, you cheated, you lied, you schemed, you're disqualified. We would have marked him off the list, but God didn't. But now God says, I'm going to change the rules. I'm going to change the game plan. From this point on, the covenant is to all the people, but they have to live up to certain obligations that I'm giving you. And then he began to give them the Ten Commandments and the Old Testament law to live by. And there's still going to be a blessing upon the people. There's still going to be a world-leading nation, but they are going to be, they're only going to be that because that they keep the law and keep the commandments. Deuteronomy 28 is a great example. In Deuteronomy 28, it says, if you will hearken and diligently observe all the laws that I've commanded you, then will I set you above the nations. And he says, and you'll be the head and not the tail. You'll be above and not beneath. And he begins to tell how that they're going to be a unique people in relationship to all the other nations of the world. But he says, but it's only if you hearken diligently to observe all the laws that I've commanded you. Because then when we get down to about verse 16, he says, and if you don't hearken diligently and observe all these laws, then, whammo, instead of being the blessed, you're the cursed. Instead of being blessed in the city, blessed in the country, blessed when you come in, blessed when you go out, then all these cursings are going to come upon you. And so he specifically says that the law is a requirement. And David, even in Psalms, tells us that it's the righteous who will inherit the land. Not just, Jacob, who was not righteous, inherited the land, but here he says you're only going to inherit the land when you're righteous. And there's so many statements throughout the entire Old Testament that says that when you turn away from God and you begin to practice idolatry and things like that I'm going to pluck you up and take you out of the land. And so there was a relationship that the people could have to the land, but it was that they had to be in the right relationship with God to have it. However, in spite of all those things, God continues to say, but yet I've still chosen you as my chosen people. And it's still my plan that you live in that land and that you be blessed and that you prosper and that you be a blessing to all the earth. Well, let's see, I didn't write it down right there. But anyway, in Ezekiel, there's a verse that specifically spells it out and says, I have intended this blessing upon you. And if you'll ever repent, if you'll ever reconsider, then I'll bring you back. And we know the passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, if my people, which are called by my name, will repent, then will I hear from heaven, and I will answer, and I will, heal your land. There's a blessing on the land when the people of Israel began to align themselves with his covenant. Now, Deuteronomy makes it very carefully distinct that God did not pick the people because that there was anything special about them. In fact, he says, the fact is that you were not special, and because you weren't special, then that's the reason that I'm using you, so that you can see the unique nature of the grace of God upon your life. And in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, the Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh the king of Egypt. And then in verse 6 of chapter 9, he says, understand therefore that the Lord thy God giveth thee not this good land to possess it for your righteousness, but for thou art a stiff-necked people. What God was saying at that point is that even in the middle of all of the requirements that he has established through the Old Testament law, he says, I still want you to understand the grace. I still want you to understand the grace of God. He says, when you violate the law, I'm going to pluck you up and take you out of the land. The land will become a habitation of dragons. It will become desolate. It'll become unusable. It'll become unfruitful. When you repent, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to reestablish you. I'm going to make the desert to bloom like a garden of roses. But I want you to understand one thing. Even when the blessing is tied to your obedience, it is not you that earned it. He says, I didn't pick you because you were so numerous. I didn't pick you because you were so good looking. I didn't pick you because that you had any special talents. I just picked you out of my own grace because I wanted to establish you as a symbol of my goodness. Now the point is that God intended all along to use the Jewish people like one massive living gospel tract. You know what a gospel tract is. You know, when you have a little piece of paper and it tells the gospel, and at the end it says, now that you've read this, won't you pray this prayer and get born again? God intended the Jews to be like one massive national gospel tract that the world could look and say, look at this. Man, is there no other people who have such a unique relationship with their God? And it would be something that would turn the nations to God. Because through the Jews, God intended to bless them so that all the rest of the world could be blessed. Isaiah said it this way, you're to be the light to the Gentiles. And we'll pick it up there after our next break. God bless. We were talking about the fact that Isaiah called the Jewish people a light to the Gentiles. And the whole purpose that God chose the Jewish people from the very beginning, part of the covenant of Abraham, was that through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And we are not talking about people that is just an academic topic for us. Oh, we're going to talk about the people of Israel, and tomorrow we'll talk about the people of Ethiopia. And then the next day we're going to talk about the people of Micronesia. But we're talking about a group of people that God has chosen, that God has put a covenant upon, God has put a blessing upon, because that through them all the families of the earth, including your family and my family, are blessed. So if we don't understand what God's plan for them is, and then we don't understand what God's relationship for us with them is, then we don't understand what God is trying to do. Now, how are the people of Israel a blessing to the whole world? I have on page 10 several things. Number one is monotheism. It was the Jews who introduced to the world the understanding that there's one God and that they're not multiple gods. And it was through the Jews that the Word of God was given to us. Except for Luke, everybody who wrote in the Bible was a Jew. Luke is the only Gentile who has a section in the Bible. The blessing comes to us through faith. The Jews learned how to live by faith and to believe by faith, and then that therefore set a pattern for us. And then the coming of the Messiah, to understand that Jesus is going to be the Messiah and that Jesus came to us through the Jewish race is, of course, the most important blessing of all. But that we see many examples of how that the Jews have been the blessing to the nations of the earth. But I also was making the point that God chose the Jewish people to be like a great gospel tract, so that we could look at the Jew and we could see the blessing of God, or see the call of God for all of us. And in every nation that has risen up, there has always been at least one significant Jewish person that God placed there as a testimony to His goodness and to His grace and to His plan. In Egypt, it was Joseph. Joseph was there, who stood up before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to him, can you interpret the dream? And Joseph says, well, I have a God who can. Okay, so he stood up as an example to the people of Egypt. In Babylon, there was Daniel. In fact, it's very significant that when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den and the lions didn't eat him up, that the next day the king wrote a decree and sent it out through the entire empire and said, everybody ought to pay attention to Daniel's God, because there's no other God like Daniel's God. The Medo-Persian Empire, also Daniel was a representative in that upcoming empire. And then the Persian Empire that developed out of the Medo-Persian Empire, we had Nehemiah, who rose up there and was in a position of authority, and then went to Israel and helped rebuild the walls and stuff. And then we have Esther, who was part of the empire and was the queen. And when there was a plot to destroy the people of Israel through a massive genocide, she stood up and became a testimony before the king, spoke the word of God to him, and then that rescued all the people. In Syria, there was a little girl. She was a slave girl, and when her master or her mistress, she worked for the wife, spoke to her about her husband's leprosy, the little slave girl says, if only he could go to Israel and see the prophet. And then lo and behold, Naaman goes to Israel and gets healed, and he brings back the message of God to the whole kingdom of Syria. Obadiah was said to be an ambassador among the nations. Assyria had Jonah. Jonah, went to Nineveh and stood up, and he told the people, in 40 days you're going to be crispy critters. You're going to be burned to a crisp. And then God used that as an opportunity to bring the people of Nineveh to salvation. And then Solomon was a witness to the whole earth. His testimony went out among all the kingdoms of the world, and especially we remember the specific story about the Queen of Sheba who came, and she says, man, your testimony is so spread out, and we've heard it in all the nations of the world, and man, it sounds like to me that this is such an exaggerated legend that it can't be true, and I just wanted to come and check it out. And then she almost fainted when she says, man, I haven't even heard half of the story about how great you are. And then, of course, the Roman Empire had Jesus and all the early Christians. So every major empire in history, there has always been a Jewish person who rose up as a representative and as a symbol to be a testimony to God. And then in the law, in the Old Testament, God made a point to say that even the people who are not Jews, that we want to incorporate them. We want them to be able to participate in the blessing that I have established for the Jewish people. In the Passover, there was a specific provision that if there was a stranger that was living in the land, that the stranger could participate in the Passover and the Sabbath and in sacrificing. And there was a commandment that said that the Gentiles should not be oppressed. The Jews should remember how that they were treated when they were slaves in Egypt, and remember not to oppress somebody who was living among you. And they were allowed to glean in the fields of the Jews. God specifically said that when you raise your crops and you go around and you are harvesting, that you leave the corners, and that the corners are going to be for the strangers. And the strangers is the word that means people that are from other countries that are living in your area. Now, let's think about it. If you are harvesting with a scythe, with a sickle, and you make a swipe like this, then that's going to be a round curve that you're cutting. Okay, but if your field has a corner, then there's going to be a square corner and then a round circle, and so there's going to be a semicircle that's going to be left that you didn't cut. Now, you could easily take one step more and go back and get that. But God said, never do that. Always leave that for the people who come behind you, the poor, the destitute, the hungry, and the strangers. Now, it would not just be on the four corners of the field. But every time you made a step forward and you used your scythe again, what's going to happen? There's going to be a rounded circle, and there's going to be a little spot between it and the last circle that you just made, right? And so that means that all through your field, there are going to be little splotches of grain that you didn't cut when you made your first swipe. God says, I am making abundant provision for the strangers, for the people who are from the other tribes and the other nations. And then point number 6 on the top of page 12, I say there was an early version of the golden rule. And again, I've already kind of mentioned that when I said, remember how that you were treated when you were in Egypt? So don't treat other people like that. So it's like, don't, do unto others like you would have them do unto you. The interesting thing is that not only were the Gentiles to be accepted and treated nicely, they were actually, in many cases, totally incorporated into the covenant promise of God. Two particular individuals are Rahab and Ruth. Rahab, remember, was the woman that that took care of the spies, protected the spies when they went into Bethlehem. And according to the Scriptures, she actually married into the Jewish race, and she actually is listed in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of Jesus' ancestors. The same thing with Ruth. Ruth was a Moabitess, and she came and she was one of those who was gleaning in the fields, and she actually wound up marrying Boaz and became, again, the descendant or an ancestor of David and an ancestor of Jesus. Amazingly, these are both Gentile women, but they were not only incorporated into the covenant blessing of God, but were so intimately incorporated that they became ancestors to Jesus, who was the fulfillment of the covenant of God. I mean, you talk about God saying, I want to bless the nations. He was blessing the nations and bringing them right into the very heart of His covenant provision. In Ezekiel, God's actions were seen as a witness to the nations. There are over 60 times in that one book of Ezekiel in which it says, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Because that what I do, they shall know that I am the Lord. And so there was a reaching out to the people. And then Isaiah, he specifically addresses 8 different ethnic groups or 8 different nations in his prophecy. And then in Isaiah, he also has 3 different times in which he specifically says that the Jews are the light to the Gentiles. In Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, and Isaiah 62. Now, the problem is that even though that God said that He is going to bless the people of Israel, and through them all the nations of the earth will be blessed, that the nations have generally made the option to curse Israel rather than to bless Israel. Remember, God says, everyone that blesses you will be blessed, and everyone that curses you will be cursed. And now I want to just kind of give us a little historical story to see how the nations of the earth have chosen to curse Israel and therefore have experienced His curse rather than His blessing. In the textbook on page 46, we talk about 2 people that the Bible specifically mentions, and one of them is Potiphar, and the other is Laman. And Potiphar, his story is in Genesis 39, verse 2, and Laman's story is in chapter 30, verse 27. But both of these men recognized that they were blessed because of the Jewish person, the covenant person that was living with them. Potiphar, it said, and his house was blessed. He prospered in everything he did because Joseph was there. However, in spite of the fact that he knew that the blessing that was on his life and the blessing that was on his business was because of Joseph, he still threw Joseph in jail without a trial, without having an opportunity to defend himself, because that he wanted to honor his wife and defend his wife and legitimize his wife, rather than to go to the trouble to give a fair trial to Joseph when Joseph was accused. Same thing is essential in Laban. Laban realized that the prosperity that was coming to him was because that Jacob was living and working for him, living with him and working for him. Yet, he still tried to cheat him out of everything he could get. He changed his wages 20 times. He kept trying to renegotiate because he said he didn't want him to be blessed. He didn't want him to prosper. He tried to siphon everything off for himself. Okay, now the Gentile nations in general have fallen to the curse of Abraham rather than to the blessing of Abraham. Egypt had a king that rose up after Joseph passed away, and it said, and he knew not Joseph. And because he didn't know him, then he didn't honor the people that were there, and he tried to turn them into slaves, and eventually planned a great genocide against the people. The Assyrians invaded Israel and devastated and left devastation in their wake. The Babylonian Empire blasphemed the God of Israel by drinking wine out of the golden cups that belonged in the temple at Jerusalem. The Persian king had a man named Haman who rose up, and he said that he would pay to be able to exterminate the Jewish people, and they planned a great genocide in which they were going to destroy all of the Jews that lived in the kingdom. The Greek Empire was a horrible empire that rose up to destroy the Jewish people. They instituted what we call Hellenism. And Hellenism was a plan to bring one culture, one language, and one lifestyle to the entire world. And that lifestyle, that culture, was in opposition to the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, and therefore they tried to eliminate the Jews and eliminate everything that they believed in and practiced. The Apocrypha that is in the Catholic Bible but not in the Protestant Bible, there's a section called the Maccabees. The Maccabees is a tremendous historical record of the time of the Greek Empire when it was opposing the Jewish people. And it tells us the story of how horribly they treated the Jewish people and tried to destroy them. One of the things that they did is that they invaded the city of Jerusalem on the Sabbath, because they knew that the Jews wouldn't fight and do any work on the Sabbath. And so therefore they could just march right in and take the city and take the temple. And they demanded that pigs be sacrificed on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. All this sorts of things just to totally, humiliate and destroy the Jewish people. And then the same thing happened with the Romans. The Romans were a very cruel taskmaster over the Jews. They conquered the Greek Empire, including conquering Israel, and were the ruling force. And we've all seen the different movies, like the Ben-Hur movies and all those that let us see how cruelly that the Romans ruled over Israel. Okay, point number 14 is a continuation in Lesson 3 of the Curse of Abraham. And it brings us to the Diaspora. Not only did the Jews have persecution in their own land by the invading armies that came and took over their land, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., but they also, once they were scattered, were persecuted wherever they were sent. The Romans in 70 A.D. Destroyed the temple and conquered Israel. There was some resistance that went on for a few years, and eventually the last stronghold was the destruction of the fortress of Masada, when it was a huge fortress that had been built by King Herod out in the next to the Dead Sea. It's 1,200 feet above the ground level below it, right on top of a huge rock cliff, and so there was no way that anybody could get up there without being destroyed by the people who were at the top. There were about 1,000 Jews who were living up there that had run away from the Roman army, and they were hiding out up there. They had enough food, enough water sources that they had stored up there that would have kept them for a number of years. They did not have to surrender. And the Romans encamped around them and wanted to take the fortress. The only way they could do it was to build a ramp that went up. And so they were building this ramp, but they knew that because the Jews were on top. All they had to do was throw stones down, and they could, the velocity of the stone coming down off the cliff could destroy them. And so they took Jewish slaves and made them build a ramp. And so they were building the ramp using Jewish slaves, and the people who were captured on top of or who were encamped on top of the cliff weren't about to kill their relatives and kill their countrymen, and so they let them build a ramp. They built the ramp. It came all the way up to the front door of the fortress, and then the night before that, the Romans broke through and took the city, took the fortress. All the people inside the camp committed suicide. They'd rather die at their own hands than die at the hands of the Romans. The Romans were very cruel. When they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, it's an estimate that there were probably 2 million people who were holed up inside the city of Jerusalem, and the Romans killed them and destroyed them. They encamped around about the city, not letting people get in or out, and so there was no food, no water. People inside the city were starving to death. They were eating shoe leather, whatever, just to try to stay alive. If they went out into the streets, then they were, shot with the arrows or whatever, so people were holed up in their homes. The women, if a man was killed, the women were afraid to even go out and try to drag his body back in because they knew they were going to be killed. Some people did try to escape, and when they had tried to escape over the wall, the thing that they would do is that they would take whatever silver or gold coins or whatever they could get, they would swallow them, so that eventually they would pass out, and then they would have that to support themselves. The Romans figured out that the Jews were climbing over the wall with money in their stomachs, and as soon as they climbed over the wall, they cut their bellies open while they were still alive to ravage through their bellies to see if there was any gold or silver there. It was a horrible way that the Romans dealt with the Jews. But at any rate, after 70 AD, after they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, they commanded that no Jews could ever live in Israel or Jerusalem again. And so they excommunicated, they sent everybody out, everybody was expelled out of the country. And that was what we call the Diaspora. They were scattered throughout the rest of the world. And as they were scattered throughout the rest of the world, the Jews experienced a lot of persecution and a lot of difficulty everywhere they went. One of the things that happened, though, is that because the Jews have a covenant blessing from God, and because that they are generally very intelligent and generally very diligent with what they did, they had a tendency to move out of slavery and into positions of prosperity. And that, again, would cause them to have some discrimination, because the people would say, look at you, you came over here and you're taking our jobs. And, so they didn't like that. So there was a lot of persecution that would happen where they were spread. The Christian church treated the Jewish race harshly. Now, I can understand why. Because the Jewish synagogue practice is they have what are called 12 blessings that they give at the end of every service. Blessed is he who, blessed is he who, blessed is he who. Okay, but when the early Christians, because of their Jewish background, their Jewish heritage, and because that the only Bible they had was the Old Testament as the New Testament was being developed, tried to remain inside the Jewish synagogues and Jewish practice. And so they added a 13th blessing, which was really a cursed blessing. And it said, after 12 blessings, there was a 13th statement, curses everyone who, essentially says Jesus is Lord. And so when they would close with the 13 benedictions, the Christians couldn't say it, because it was actually a curse against those who thought that Jesus was the Messiah. And so that was a way of exposing who was a Christian and making them have to eliminate themselves out of the synagogue worship. And so, because the Jews had done that to the Christians, then I can understand why the Christians would have some hostility against the Jews, because they were the ones who were discriminated against first. Okay, so the Christian church treated the Jewish race very harshly in the diaspora. And I'll give you some examples. For instance, in 610 to 641, the whole practice of Judaism, public practice of Judaism, was outlawed. And so if you tried to hold a synagogue service or whatever, you were breaking the law. In 626, the Jews were expelled out of Gaul, which is France of today. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, you may know those names because they were the ones who funded Columbus's exploration in which he found the New World. But in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, they expelled all the Jews out of the whole land of Spain. Interestingly, that was the same year Spain had been under control of the Arabs, of the Muslims, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But the Jews in Spain had been accepted by the Arabs, by the Muslims, and they had positions of authority in the country. Some political positions and positions of significance in the business world and in the professional world. Anyway, so when the Christians took over the country and they expelled the Muslims, then the Pope also told King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, you need to get rid of the Jews at the same time. And so the Jews were expelled out of Spain in 1492. And then the anti-Semitic feelings flavored all the history of Christian Europe. One of the things that happened is that Europe was under what we call the feudal system. And the feudal system is a system in which, somewhat like the caste system in India, everybody has his own place in society. You are a landowner, you are a lord, you are a duke, you are a peasant, you are a farm worker. Everybody had a place, a strata in society. Now, the thing is that you had not only a position in society, but you had a position in the church as well. You had a relationship with the church because of where you were within the feudal system. Now, if you weren't a church person, then therefore you didn't fit into the feudal system, and therefore you didn't have a place in society. And so the Jews were essentially excluded. They didn't have a place where they fit at all in society. And because of that, they became merchants. And in fact, I don't know if you know this expression in Canada, but in the United States, at least in the southern part of the states where I grew up, there used to be a term that would be, if you were bargaining over a price of something, you'd say, well, I Jewed the man down. Well, that is a discriminatory term against Jews, but it really originated with the merchandising business, because the term merchant and the Jew were simultaneous. They were interchangeable. So if you were a merchant, you were a Jew. And if you bargained and you tried to negotiate a price, then you were Jewing. So it really was associated with business dealings and negotiations more than anything else. But because the Jews couldn't own land and didn't fit into society, then you had to find a job that was somewhat transient and didn't require having a permanent place to do business. So the merchants at that time usually were traveling merchants that would have all of their goods in a wagon or whatever, and then they would come through town and they would say, anybody here need sewing thread? Anybody here need a box of soap or whatever? And then they would bargain and they would sell their goods on the street corners like that. And so, that's what happened to the Jews during that system. Then something interesting happened. the Catholic Church decided to make a law against usury. And the Bible speaks against usury. It speaks about loaning out money at interest. Now, the term usury actually means at an excessive rate of interest. But the Catholic Church made a law against loaning out money at any rate of interest. So, if you can't loan out money, if you can't make interest when you loan out money, then most people aren't interested in loaning out money. I'm not going to give you $10, just to give you $10, and then you pay me back $10, a year from now, because I've gone for that year without my money. Okay, now if I give you $10 and a year from now you're going to give me $12, I may be willing to do that because I've made a little bit of profit off of not having my money for that year. So, but if you just say no loan, no interest loans is the only thing you can do, then all of a sudden business collapses because there are very few people who can start a business with what money he already has. Almost anybody that's going to open a business has to get a capital loan to start a business. And then after he runs the business a while, he can pay back the capital loan. So business starts to collapse because the ruling of the Catholic Church, no interest loans. Aha! There happen to be Jews who are not Catholics. And because they're not Catholics, they can loan money at interest. So everybody starts going to the Jews to borrow money. And in borrowing money, then the Jews are beginning to make a profit. That's where most of the international banking system in the world developed, is from the fact that the Jews were the only people who could collect interest back in the medieval period. Another thing that happened during this time is that when the Jews realized that they had to always be flexible because there's no telling who's going to decide to expel them from their country, they moved into the jewelry industry because it's pretty hard to stick a 40-acre cornfield in your back pocket and run, but it is pretty easy to stick a 5-carat diamond in your back pocket and run. You see? And so they tried to invest in things that were small but yet valuable. And so that's the reason that most of the jewelry industry today is under Jewish control. Every time that they tried to oppress the Jews, it's surprising how that God caused them to prosper in the process of that. But the government looked around, the king looked around, and he says, there's something funny going on in my kingdom. There's this group of people who are making a whole lot of money. And you know what? We're not making any taxes off of them. Why? Because the taxation system was run through the feudal system, which was connected to the church, and the Jews were not part of the church, so therefore they were not part of the feudal system, so therefore they were not part of the taxation system. So the king looked around and he said, golly gee, look at all this money that I should be having. And so he established a whole new division in the kingdom called the people of the king, who could be taxed directly by the king, even though they didn't go through the feudal system. That was the way that was feeding the taxes to the king already. Okay, so even though that they were considered the people of the king, that didn't give them any special privilege. All that meant is they had to pay taxes, and they still suffered under all the rest of the persecution that came. When the Black Death, the bubonic plague, swept through Europe, who do you think got blamed? The Jews. Just, who cared? Just as many Jews were dying from the plague as were the Gentiles. They were the culprit. And many Jews decided, okay, well, I'm going to pretend to be a Christian. And so they pretended to be Christians to escape the persecution. And so they would attend church on Sunday, and then secretly they would have their Jewish rituals, their Jewish synagogues, and everything on the Sabbath. However, what that what was instituted as a process of that was what we call the Inquisition, where that the Catholic Church and the government said, we want to find out who is doing this camouflage thing. So they would do things like on a Saturday, Jewish law forbids starting a fire on the Sabbath. So on a Saturday, when it was cold weather, they would go and stand on top of a hill and look out over the city and look for the chimneys that didn't have smoke coming out of them. Because if there wasn't smoke in the chimney, that meant there wasn't a fire in the fireplace. If there wasn't a fire in the fireplace, that meant there must be a Jew in the house. And they would go and they would capture the people who were in the houses with no smoke coming out of the fireplaces on the Sabbath, and they would persecute them and do all kinds of horrible things and even kill them. And so there was one thing after another that was a persecution that was instituted against the Jews. The Lateran Council in 1179 forbade the Jews and Christians to dwell together. The result of that was the ghetto. The ghetto was an isolated community in which the Jews lived. They were not allowed to live in the same communities with Christians. Now, the ghetto, because it's a certain size piece of land, might be a workable idea today. But you get a couple that get married and they have a baby, and now you have 3 people in the space that you had 2. They have another baby, and now you have 4 people in the space you had 2. They have another baby, and now you have 5 people in the space you have 2. Those people grow up, they get married, they have babies, and before you know it, you have multiple people in the space where you originally had 2. So what do? They have to have more room, they have to have more space, they have to have more bedrooms and more bathrooms, and how were you going to handle it? They couldn't go out, so they decided to go up. And in the ghettos, they started building multi-level houses. That was the original beginning of the high-rise apartment system. Every time that they tried to do something hostile to the Jews, God had a way of causing them to come up with some kind of new ingenuity that actually became a blessing to the nations. Okay, and there was a brief period in which a brief period of reprieve for the rejection of the Jews, and that came during the Re-Enlightenment, which was at the end of the Middle Ages and then the French Revolution. And even there was a reestablishment of the Sanhedrin Council in 806. Now, in Germany, there was what was called pro-Aryanism. Pro-Aryanism is national pride, and national pride is a good thing. Everybody ought to be proud and appreciate his heritage, his ethnic background. However, it's a problem when pride in one nation, or nationality, one ethnic background, becomes discrimination against another one. And what happened is that pro-Aryanism turned into anti-Semitism. And when that, instead of being proud of my heritage, I began to be disparaging against somebody who has another heritage, then that's a problem. And that eventually led us to the Nazi period. In Russia, they passed what were called the May Laws. And in the May Laws, that expelled all the Jews out of all the villages and rural areas. Now, the real issue with that is that the May Laws were put in effect in what was called the Veil of Settlement, which was an almost exclusive Jewish neighborhood or community area of the country where it was almost exclusively Jews. And you couldn't live in your own house. You couldn't live in your own neighborhood. You couldn't live in your own community. You had to be expelled. And so the Jews were expelled. to where that they began to move, especially a lot of them moved to America. In a 30-year period, the Jewish population in America excelled 6 times. 6 times as much as it was in a 30-year period. And then in the next 30 years, then it quadrupled again. So, the Jewish population moving into America because they were being expelled out of their own communities in the Vale of Settlement was tremendous. Then it became that there was such an immigration of Jews into America that the Americans put up some limitations and said, this many and no more, but the people were still coming, and so they began to move into Western Europe. They moved into the Orient, they moved into South America, and into other places, Africa, India, wherever they could go. But they began to migrate all over the world because they were getting kicked out. Those that didn't leave, that tried to stay, they became subject of pogroms, which is public riots. And the people would just have a riot in the fact that there were still Jews living in their communities. They would break into their shops and destroy all the merchandise that they were selling. They would break into their homes and destroy their homes, and all kinds of tremendous persecution like that. And then this eventually culminated in World War I. There were 2 great world wars, World War I and World War II. World War I, the significance of that prophetically was that World War I led to the establishment or the elimination of Turkish rule in the Middle East. The Turks had ruled the Middle East for 300 years. And the city of Jerusalem particularly was held by the Ottoman Turks. 300 years of Turkish rule in the Middle East was ended with World War I. And when the European nations that fought in World War I, England and France and the other countries, were given authority to rule in the Middle East, to establish rule, to establish government, as a result of the Turks being eliminated from there, that opened the door for some Jews to begin to remigrate, and it opened the door for a hope that eventually the Jewish people would be able to reestablish themselves in the land of Israel. However, that was not a major thing that was on the radar for most people, because most people didn't want to go back to the desolate, arid, undeveloped land of Israel. It was a destitute land. It was not something that anybody would dream of as your homeland. And it was, nobody had a desire to go do that. They wanted to stay in Europe. They wanted to stay in America. They wanted to stay wherever they had spread out around the world. God sent World War II, or I wouldn't say God sent, but God used World War II in the next step, because it was only after the Holocaust, only after the Nazi persecution of the Jews, that the world could smell the smell of human flesh being burned at Auschwitz. That the world said, you know what, we ought to get behind these Jews and give them a place to go. And at that point, then they said, we're going to establish a country for the Jews to go to in the land of Israel. And the Jews that didn't want to go, when everything that they had been destroyed, everything they had been burned, everything that they had been decimated, and they had nothing to go back to. And even if they had something to go back to, their mama wasn't there because she had been burned in Auschwitz. Their daddy wasn't there because that he had been executed. Their brothers and sisters weren't there because they had wound up in the mass graves all over Europe. They said, we don't want to go back, even if we can. We want to go somewhere else and start all over new, start all over fresh. And so it wasn't until after World War II that there was a desire among the Gentile nations a willingness among the Gentile nations and a desire among the Jewish people to go back home and reestablish himself in the land of Israel. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a tremendous bloodbath in World War I and an even worse bloodbath in World War II that birthed the possibility of a land called Israel. But that isn't the end. There is still another bloodbath that is yet to come. And we'll talk about that when we talk about prophecy. We'll talk about the fact that there's a Armageddon coming and that there is a horrible experience that is facing the world that will bring about the establishment of the ultimate kingdom of God in the land of Israel, when Jesus Christ himself will sit on the throne and will inhabit the temple that God will rebuild after the Antichrist attempt, that God will rebuild in the land of Israel. So there's much more ahead, and it is even more tragic than everything that we've been through up to this point. In our next class, we're going to look at some prophecies from the book of Daniel, how that Daniel had a vision that showed the nations of the earth and how that they would work through what we know as history to establish a place for what we will know as prophecy. All right, God bless you. We'll see you again after the break.